Good day, everyone. I, Euve Grace Ross, together with my group mates, Jubelle Rosal, Andrie Marcjay Rosite, and Matt Simon Urbiztondo, are going to discuss to you the lesson 7, which is all about gender and sexuality. Now let's start with understanding gender and sexuality, because we all know that gender is not the same as sex. To clearly define these two, let's pay attention first to gender. Gender consists of two components: our internal sense of gender and how we express our gender or present ourselves to the world. Our internal sense of gender. This means our gender identity. Gender identity is defined as personal conception of oneself as male or female. This concept is also related to gender role that defined as the outward manifestation of personality that reflect the gender identity. How we express our gender or present ourselves to the world. This is basically our gender presentation or gender expression. So when we say gender presentation or expression, this means a personal behavior, mannerism, interests, and appearances that are associated with gender in a particular cultural context, particularly with categories of femininity and masculinity. Now let's talk about sexuality. Sexuality or sexual orientation is about sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors towards other people. There are several types of sexuality. These are heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and asexuality. Heterosexual, attracted to the opposite gender identity. This is also known as straight people. Next is homosexual, attracted to the same sex, such as gays or lesbians. Next would be bisexual, attracted to people of more than one gender identity, wherein a boy can be attracted to either a girl or a boy. Last would be the asexuality, means no sexual attraction. Now let's proceed to feminism. Feminism is a social and political movement that is about changing the way people see the ability of both gender and basically campaigning for equal ones. There are at least 4 different feminism. First is the radical feminism. In radical feminism, women's oppression is the result of the system of patriarchy. This means a system of domination in which men as a group have power over women as a group. Next is Marxist feminism. In Marxist feminist analysis, the ultimate source of oppression is the capitalism. It means that the domination of women by men is seen as a consequence of capital over labor. Liberal feminism. It differs from radical and Marxist feminism in that it does not suggest a system which is patriarchy or capitalism in determining the oppression of women. Instead, it tends to see the problem in terms of male prejudice against women, embodied in law or expressed in the inclusion of women from particular areas of life. Last would be the dual systems theory according to Sylvia Walby of 1990. These represent the coming together of radical and Marxist feminism, where women's oppression is the result of a complex articulation of both patriarchy and capitalism. There are also other feminist perspectives. For instance, here Rosemary Tong of 1992 has also a list. These are liberal, Marxist, radical, psychoanalytic, socialist, existentialist, and postmodern. Feminism is always more than a body of academic texts and practices. It is a political movement concerned with women's oppression and the ways and means to empower women. According to African American critic Bell Hooks of 1989, Feminism is finding a voice. Popular culture has been the object of a great deal of feminist analysis. As Michelle Barrett of 1982 points out, culture politics are crucially important to feminism because they involve struggles over meaning. Lenne of 2009 makes up the same point. Feminists approaching popular culture proceed from a variety of theoretical positions that carry with them a deeper social analysis and political agenda.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jubelle Rosal from BSED English 2E. My topic is all about women at the cinema and reading romance. Women at the cinema. Movies analysis is impressive and telling throughout, and despite the fact that it is made in an essay of fewer than 13 pages, its influence has been enormous. However, having acknowledged the essay's power and influence, it should also be noted that Mulvey's solution is somewhat less telling than her analysis of the problem. As an alternative to popular cinema, Mulvey calls for an avant-garde cinema which is radical in both political and aesthetic sense and challenges the basic conceptions of the mainstream film. Some feminists, including Lorraine Gammon and Margaret Marchment 1998, have begun to doubt the universal validity of Mulvey's argument, questioning whether the gaze is always male or whether it is merely a dominant among a range of difficult ways of seeing, including the female gaze. Moreover, they insist that it is not enough to dismiss popular culture as merely serving the complementary system of capitalism and patriarchy, peddling false consciousness to the dupe masses. It can also be seen as a site where meanings are contested and where dominant ideologies can be disturbed. They advocate a cultural politics of intervention. We cannot afford to dismiss the popular by always positioning ourselves outside it. It is from popular culture that most people in our society get their entertainment and their information. It's just here women and men are offered the culture dominant definition. Furthermore, Christine Glidhill 2009 makes a similar point. She advocates a feminist cultural studies which relates commonly divided popular forms to the condition of their consumption in the lives of socio-historical constituted audiences. In this respect, she observes feminist analysis of the women's film and soap opera is beginning to counter more negative cine-psychoanalytic the accountants of female spectatorship. Hollywood and female spectatorship, according to Jackie Stacey 1994 or Stargazing, presents a clear rejection of the universalism and textual determinism of how much psychoanalytic work on female audience. Her own analysis begins with the audiences in the cinema rather than the audience constructed by the text, in which her approach take her from the traditions of film studies. Jackie Stacey conducted a research or analysis to the white British women who almost aged over 60 and mostly working class who had been keen cinema goers in 1940s and 1950s. On the basis letters and completed questionnaires, she organized her analysis in terms of three discourses generated by the responses themselves: escapism, identification, and consumerism. This is the table 7.1, Film as Object of Study in Film Studies and Cultural Studies by Jackie Stacey. Under film studies are spectatorship positioning, textual analysis, meaning as production lead, passive viewer, unconscious, and pessimistic. Under cultural studies are audience readings, ethnographic methods, meaning as consumption lead, active viewer, conscious, and optimistic. Escapism is one of the most frequent cited reasons given by the women for going to the cinema. Seeking to avoid the pejorative connotations of escapism, is Stacey using Richard Dyer's 1999 excellent argument for the utopian sensibility of much popular entertainment to construct an account to the utopian possibilities of Hollywood cinema for British women in the 1940s and 1950s. Dyer deploys a set of binary questions, oppositions, to reveal the relationship between the social problems experienced by the audiences and the textual solutions played out in the text of popular entertainment. This is the table 7.2 popular texts and utopian solutions. Under social problems are scarcity, exhaustion, dreariness, manipulation, and fragmentation. Under textual solutions are abundance, energy, intensity, transparency, and community. For Dyer, entertainment's utopian sensibility is a property of the text. Stasis extends his argument to exclude the social context in which entertainment is experienced. The letters and completed questionnaires by the women made it clear to her that the pleasures of the cinema text, they included the ritual of attending a screening, the shared experience and imagined community of the audience, the comfort and the comparative luxury of the cinema building. Though it was never a simple matter of enjoying the glamour of Hollywood. And now, let's proceed to the three discourses generated by Jackie Stacy in her analysis. Escapism. Escapism is always a historically specific two-way event. Stacy's women, therefore, were not only escaping into the luxury of the cinema and the glamour of Hollywood film. Next is identification. Identification in Stacy's second category of analysis. She is aware of how it often functions in psychoanalytic criticism to point the way in which film texts are said to position female spectators in the interest of patriarchy. She claims that identification can be shown often to work quite differently. Stacy's third category is consumption. She insists that consumption is a site of negotiated meanings, of resistance, and of appropriation as well as the subjections and exploitations. In addition, Stacy's work represents something of a rebook to the universalistic claims of much cine psychoanalysis. By studying the audience, female spectatorship might be seen as a process of negotiating the dominant meanings of the Hollywood cinema. That's all for the women at the cinema. My next topic is reading romance. In Loving with Vengeance, Tanya Modleski, 1982, claims that women writing about feminine narratives tends to adopt of the three possible positions. Tanya argues that what she calls mass-produced fantasies for women, including the romance novel, speak to very real problems and tensions in women's lives. In spite of this, she acknowledged that the way in which these narratives resolve problems and tensions will rarely please modern feminists. However, the reader of fantasies and the feminist reader do have something in common. Furthermore, Modleski does not condemn the novels of the women who read them. Rather, she condemns the conditions which have them necessary. Nevertheless, she notes how students occasionally cut their women's studies classes to find out what is going on in their favorite soap opera. We all know mostly women are attached with this kind of novels or soap opera. According to Rosalind Coward's 1984, she talks about the female desire that is all about the women's pleasure in popular culture. Popular culture is not looked down on from an Olympian height as the disappointing but rather predictable culture of other people. Coward's interest in romantic fiction is in a part inspired by the intriguing fact that over the past decade, the rise of feminism has been paralleled almost exactly by a mushroom growth in the popularity of romantic fiction. Coward believes two things about romantic novels. First is that they must still satisfy some very definite needs. Second, they offer evidence of and contribute to a very powerful and common fantasy. In line with this, Coward points out that romantic fiction is surely popular because it restores the childhood world of sexual relations and suppresses criticisms of the inadequacy of men, the suffocation of the family, or the damage inflicted by the patriarchal power. In addition, it simultaneously manages to avoid the guilt and fear which might come from the childhood world. Romantic fiction promises a secure world, promises that there will be safety with dependence, that there will be power with subordination. Coward believed that this is a discourse about our culture. Janice Radway also shared her observations about romance reading. In her study of romance reading, with the observation that the increase of the popularity of the genre can be in a part of explained by the important changes in book production, distribution, advertising, and marketing techniques. Reading the romance finally comes to its present that is very difficult to draw absolute conclusions about the cultural significance of romance reading. One thing Radway is clear that women do not read romances out of a sense of contentment with patriarchy. Romance reading contains an element of utopian protest, a longing for better world. Her only certainty is that it is too soon to know if romance reading can be cited simply an ideological agent of the patriarchal social order. Reading is never simply a linear con job, but a process which therefore remains dynamic and open to change. That's all for my report. Thank you for listening.
Watching Dallas was first written in Dutch in the Netherlands in 1982 and then translated into English in 1985. The context for Ang's study is the emergence of the American primetime soap Dallas as an international success, as it is watched in over 90 countries in the early 1980s. Dallas was also watched by 52% of the Netherlands population. Dallas made an impact worldwide in the early 1980s. It is in this context that Ang placed the following advertisement in Viva, a Dutch women's magazine. The work studies how an audience experiences pleasure in a soap opera using the replies of 42 viewers to an advertisement placed by Ang. Following the advertisement, she received 42 letters from both lovers and haters of Dallas. Ang writes as an intellectual and a feminist, but also as someone who has always particularly liked watching soap operas like Dallas. We are still a long way from the view from above, which has so often characterizes the relations between cultural theory and popular culture. Let's proceed to my next topic. In the preface to Inside Women's Magazine, Janice Winship explains how she has been doing research on women's magazine since 1969. She also tells that it was also around the same time that she began to regard herself as a feminist. Integrating the two, she admits, has sometimes proved difficult. Often, it was hinted that she should research something more important politically. As she continues, this did not mean that she was not critical in women's magazine, but what is crucial to a feminist cultural politics is this dialectic of attraction and rejection. As part of the aim of Inside Women's Magazine is then to explain the appeal of the magazine formula and to critically consider its limitations and potentials for change. Since their inception in the late 18th century, women's magazines have offered their readers a mixture of advice and entertainment. Regardless of politics, women's magazines continue to operate as survival manuals, providing the readers with practical advice on how to survive in a patriarchal culture. This might take on the form of an explicit feminist politics as in Spare Rib, for example, or stories of women triumphing over adversity as, for example, in Woman's Own. The politics may be different, but the formula is much the same. Women's magazine appeal to their readers by means of a combination of entertainment and useful advice. This appeal, according to Winship, is organized around a range of fictions. These can be visual fictions of advertisement or items on fashion, cookery, or family and home. They can also be actual fictions, romantic serials, 5-minute stories for example. Each in its different way attempts to draw the reader into the world of the magazine and ultimately into a world of consumption. This often leads to women being caught up in defining their own femininity inextricably through consumption. We recognize and relish the vocabulary of dreams in which ads deal. We become involved in the fictions they create. But we know full well that those commodities will not elicit the promised fiction. It doesn't matter, without bothering to buy the product, we can vicariously indulge in the good life through the image alone. This is the compensation of the experience you do not and cannot have. Magazine advertisements, like the magazine themselves, therefore provide a terrain on which to dream. In this way, they generate a desire for fulfillment through consumption. Paradoxically, this is deeply pleasurable because it is also always acknowledges the existence of the labors of the everyday.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marcjay Urbiztondo from BSED English 2E. Today, I will be discussing about men's studies and masculinities, and also I will discuss the queer theory. Now, let's start with men's studies and masculinities. When we say men's studies, it's an interdisciplinary academic field devoted to topics concerning men, masculinity, gender, culture, politics, and sexuality. It academically examines what it means to be a man in contemporary society, while the masculinities, it is broadly concerned with the social construction of what it means to be a man. Feminism has brought into being many things, but one that some feminists have already disowned is men's studies, despite Peter Schowinger's concern that for a man to think about masculinity is to become less masculine oneself. I agree to what Peter Schowinger said, that to think about masculinity is to become less masculine oneself. Because when a man knows and understands his masculinity, which is manly, he don't have to think or overthink about it because he knows to himself who he is as a man, and it lessens a man's masculinity if he has a second thought about who he is as a man because he is not sure and he is confused of who he really is as a man. The real man thinks about practical matters rather than abstract ones, and certainly does not brood upon himself or the nature of his sexuality, quoted in Showalter 1990. Many men have thought, spoken, and written about masculinity. It is true that a real man thinks about practical matters rather than abstract ones, because based on my observation, most of the men look at what is needed or important in life, such as basic needs like food, shelter, and a regular income that can sustain their daily needs. Also, a real man don't think deeply about himself or his actual gender because, as what I said earlier, a real man know that he has a heart of a man, so there is no confusion that they feel on their sexuality. Anthony Estop 33, 1986 writes in What's a Man Gotta Do? Estop's focus is on what he calls dominant masculinity, the myth of heterosexual masculinity as something essential and self-evident, which is tough, masterful, self-possessed, knowing, always in control, and etc. Estop begins from the proposition that masculinity is a cultural construct, that is, it is not natural, normal, or universal. It is being said that masculinity is a cultural construct, so that means that masculinity as one of the characteristics of a man is culturally defined, where it was influenced by a particular group of people, their beliefs, traditions, as well as their habits. But some believe that masculinity is connected to the male body, where in this view, masculinity is associated with the male genitalia, where it includes the external male sex organs. Some also believe that masculinity is influenced by biological forces such as genes and hormones. Estop also argues that dominant masculinity operates as a gender norm, and that it is against this norm, that the way many other different types of lived masculinities, including gay masculinities, are invited to measure themselves. It is true because I have seen and experienced that dominant masculinity is considered to be a gender norm in a particular group of people. That's why the various types of lived masculinities that evolve today, including gay masculinities, are trying themselves to fit in, or they just hide what they feel. One of the reasons they do this because they are scared to be discriminated, to not be accepted, and to not be respected by the society they belong. Anthony Esthope concludes that clearly men do not possibly live out the masculine myth imposed by the stories and images of the dominant culture, but neither can they live completely outside the myth, since it pervades the culture. Its coercive power is active everywhere, not just on screens, hoardings, and paper, but inside our own heads. Esthope's conclusion in relation to men's studies and masculinities clearly stated that men do not possibly live out the masculine myth imposed by the stories and images of the dominant culture. I agree to this statement because most of the men don't live out what other people thought or believe about masculinity, and they are more focused of what they believe and of who they are as a man. And most of the real men only believe that a man must be male and masculine and nothing else. But there are also some real men that accepts the diverse gender or sexuality that the modern world has nowadays. Sian Nixon's 1996 examination of Newman masculinity explored it as a regime of representation, focusing on 4 key sites of cultural circulation: the television advertising, press advertising, menswear shops, and popular magazines for men. It is true that feminists have always encouraged men to examine their masculinity, but many feminists are less than impressed with men's studies. Joyce Canaan and Christine Griffin 1990 make clear that feminist fears that such research might distort, belittle, or deny women's experiences with men and masculinity. Therefore, feminists must be even more insistent about conducting research on men for them to have a proof of their experiences with men and masculinity. Let's proceed to queer theory. But before anything else, what does queer mean? Queer is a multifaceted word that is used in different ways and means different things to different people. The first meaning of queer is attraction to people of many gender. Second is don't conform to cultural norms around gender and or sexuality. Third is a general term referring to all non-heterosexual people. Queer theory, as Paul Bursting and Colin Richardson 1995 explain, provides a discipline for exploring the relationships between lesbians, gay men, and the culture. Part of the project of queer is to attack the very naturalness of gender and, by extension, the fictions supporting compulsory heterosexuality. Judith Butler's 1999 very influential book Gender Trouble, Butler begins from Simone de Beauvoir's 1984 observation that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. The statement, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, means that the figure that the human female acquires is not determined by any biological, psychological, or economic destiny. It is civilization as a whole that creates this product, an intermediate between the female and the unique, which is called the feminine. De Beauvoir's distinction establishes an analytical difference between biological sex, nature, and gender, culture. But in general terms, sex refers to biological distinctions such as genitalia and genetic differences between males and females, while gender refers to the role of a male or female in society or the self-conception of a person or the gender identity, suggesting that while biological sex is stable, there will always be different and competing, historically and socially variable versions of femininity and masculinity. Here is the binary gender system. As you can see, this model illustrates only two biological sexes, which are the male and female, and the masculinity and femininity that refers to traits or characteristics typically associated with being male or female, respectively. The problem with this model of sex gender, according to Butler, is that it works with the assumption that there are only two biological sexes, which are the male and female, which are determined by nature. De Beauvoir's argument has the advantage of seeing gender as something made in culture. The cultural meanings that the sexed body assumes, Butler 1999, and not something fixed by nature. Butler argues that biology is itself always already culturally gendered as male and female, and as such, already guarantees a particular version of the feminine and the masculine. Therefore, the distinction between sex and gender is not a distinction between nature and culture. The category of sex is itself a gendered category, completely politically contributed, naturalized but not natural. In other words, there is not a biological truth at the heart of gender. Sex and gender are both cultural categories. So that's all for my report. Hope you learned something from our report this afternoon. Thank you for watching and God bless us all.